Beneath the fractured moon, a single drop of blood hung like a forbidden tear on the edge of a silver blade. Ilara's breath fogged the air as she stumbled through the snow-swept pines, the wind clawing at her threadbare cloak like the fingers of forgotten ghosts. The forest of Eldridge was no place for the living, they said, a labyrinth of ice-veined trees where the deuce's gaze turned cold, and the howls of the wild echoed the cries of the damned. But exile had no mercy for such warnings. Her pack had cast her out at dawn, their alpha's voice a thunderous decree. The witches demand a sacrifice, and you, Omega, are the price. No trial, no plea, just the sting of rejection, sharper than any claw, as they bound her wrists with ropes of frozen hemp and marched her to the border stones. She had always known her place in the hierarchy, low, unseen, the quiet heart that mended wounds and whispered prayers to the lunar mother. But the witches of the Shadow Coven had come in the night, their eyes like polished obsidian, demanding an Omega's blood to seal their ancient pact with the encroaching darkness. Ilara's scent, they claimed, carried the rare mark of the Pathfinder, a hidden gift that could unravel fates or bind them eternally. Her alpha, Thorn, had nodded grimly, his gaze averted, as if her life were a ledger entry to balance the pack's fragile peace. "It is the will of the Deusa," he muttered. But his words tasted of betrayal, of fear masked as duty. Now, as the sun bled into the horizon, painting the snow in hues of crimson and gold, Ilara collapsed against a gnarled root, her fingers numb from the cold. The ropes had chafed her skin raw, but she had slipped them in the deepening dusk, driven by a spark of defiance she scarcely recognized. Freedom. It felt like drowning in the vast white silence. The wind carried distant uivos, wolves perhaps, or the restless spirits of those sacrificed before her. She touched the silver chain around her neck, the pendant a small vial of her own blood, frozen into a ruby shard. It was her mother's last gift, whispered to hold the essence of their line's hidden power. "When the moon weeps, it will guide you," her mother had said before the fever claimed her. Ilara had worn it through years of servitude, a secret talisman against the world's cruelties. Now, it pulsed faintly against her chest, warm as a heartbeat in the encroaching freeze. Hunger gnawed at her belly, but it was the ache in her soul that truly weakened her. Why her? The Pathfinders were legends, Omegas who could sense the threads of destiny, weaving paths through chaos. Yet Ilara had felt nothing but the quiet rhythm of pack life, mending cloaks, tending fires, enduring the Alpha's distant regard. Rejection had stripped her bare, leaving only questions. Was this the Deusa's test, or merely the cruelty of men who feared what they could not control? She curled into herself, the snow seeping through her matted hair, and closed her eyes against the rising wind. Sleep tugged at her, a siren's call to surrender. But the forest stirred. A low growl rumbled through the underbrush, not the feral snarl of a lone wolf, but something deeper, laced with pain. Ilara's eyes snapped open, her Omega instincts flaring like a struck flint. The air thickened with the scent of blood. Fresh, metallic, mingled with the musk of alpha dominance and something darker, like charred oak and storm winds. She pressed herself against the tree, heart pounding in sync with the distant thunder of paws on snow. From the shadows emerged a figure, massive and cloaked in midnight fur that blended with the twilight. He moved with the grace of a predator, yet each step faltered, a limp betraying injury. Blood matted his pelt along one flank, and as he drew nearer, the moonlight caught the glint of golden eyes, eyes that burned with regal fire, even in torment. This was no ordinary wolf. The air hummed with his power, an aura that made the pines bow slightly as if in deference. The Alpha King, she realized with a jolt. Kael Draven, sovereign of the northern realms, whose name was whispered in awe and dread across the packs. Rumors spoke of his melancholy reign, haunted by the loss of his mate to a rival's blade. his heart armored in guilt and unyielding duty. He shifted as he neared, bones cracking like winter branches, fur receding to reveal a man forged of steel and shadow. Broad-shouldered, with raven hair streaked by silver, he wore a cloak torn at the edges, stained with the same blood that dripped from a gash across his throat. A deliberate wound, shallow but symbolic, as if offered in ritual defiance. His gaze locked on her, piercing through the gloom, and for a moment the world narrowed to the space between them. Instinct surged in Alara's veins, a pull both terrifying and magnetic, like the tide answering the moon. Fear coiled in her gut. Would he see her as prey, an exiled Omega ripe for claiming? Or worse, as the sacrifice the witches sought, her blood the key to their dark ambitions? Kyle's breath came ragged, his hand pressing the wound at his neck. "You," he rasped, voice like gravel under boot, "bear the scent of the forsaken. The witch's mark clings to you." He took a step closer, the snow crunching softly, his eyes searching hers with an intensity that stripped away her defenses. Curiosity flickered there, warring with his evident exhaustion, but beneath it lurked a deeper shadow, guilt, perhaps, for the war he had ignited by offering his own throat in place of an innocence. The northern realms teetered on the brink now, packs rallying against the Coven's encroachment, all because one king chose mercy over tradition. Ilara's fingers tightened around the pendant, its frozen blood warming against her skin. The Deuce's symbols swirled in her mind, the moon above, fracturing light on the snow, the fire of his gaze defying the cold. Was this encounter fate's cruel jest, or the first thread of a path she was destined to walk? Strength, she thought, was not in claws or crowns, but in facing the storm with eyes wide open. Yet as he extended a hand, scarred and steady, the weight of choice pressed upon her. Flee into the night, or step toward the unknown fire of redemption. The wind howled its ancient question, and in the silence that followed, Alara wondered if mercy could truly crown the fallen, or if it would only draw them both into the abyss. Alara's pulse thundered in her ears, a wild drum against the frozen hush of the forest, as Kale's hand remained extended, palm upturned like an offering to the indifferent moon. The pendant at her throat burned hotter now, its ruby core a secret flame against the chill that seeped into her bones. She stared at the gash across his neck, the blood there congealing into dark rivulets that traced the hard lines of his jaw, a crimson map of defiance. This king, whose throne commanded the frozen spires of the north, had bared his throat to the witch's blades, not in surrender, but in a desperate gambit to spare another. Whispers of the tale had reached even the fringes of her pack, the Coven's demand for Omega blood to fuel their shadow rites, and Kale's roar of refusal, his own vein offered instead. It had shattered the fragile truce, igniting war's embers across the realms. Yet here he stood, not as conqueror, but as quarry, hunted by the very darkness he sought to defy. Fear rooted her to the snow-dusted earth, a vice around her ribs. Omegas did not parley with kings. They served, they endured, they faded into the pack's shadow. To accept his hand was to invite the storm's fury upon herself, to weave her fragile thread into the tapestry of his guilt-laden fate. But curiosity stirred beneath the terror, a whisper from the pendant's warmth, urging her to see the man beyond the myth. His golden eyes held no command, only a weary plea, shadowed by the weight of choices that had cost him everything. "I mean you no harm," he said, his voice a low rumble, like distant thunder rolling over the pines. "The witch's hunt spreads like frost. If you run alone, they will find you before the dawn." She rose slowly, knees protesting the cold, her cloak whispering against the snow like a lover's regret. The wind tugged at them both, carrying the faint tang of smoke from some far-off blaze, perhaps the first skirmishes of the war he had unleashed. Alara's instincts warred within her, the Omega pull to yield, to seek shelter in alpha strength, clashed against the raw wound of her exile. Thorn's betrayal lingered like a scar, his averted eyes a reminder that power often cloaked cowardice. Why trust this stranger whose very presence hummed with the peril of destiny? Yet as their gazes held, something intangible bridged the space. A flicker of recognition, as if the Deusa herself had etched their paths to cross under this fractured light. Kyle lowered his hand, respecting her silence, but his stance shifted, alert to the forest's murmurs. A distant howl pierced the night, not the wild cry of beasts, but the organized baying of pursuers, shadow hounds, the coven's cursed familiars, their forms twisting between wolf and wraith. "They come," he murmured, his breath clouding the air like a prophecy. Without another word, he turned, gesturing toward a narrow ravine where the pines thickened into an impenetrable wall. Ilara hesitated, the pendant's pulse syncing with her heartbeat, a rhythmic insistence that this was no mere chance. Rational thought screamed to flee southward, toward forgotten trails and solitude. But the pull was instinctive, a gravitational force born of shared forsakenness, her rejection mirroring his self-inflicted wound. She followed, her boots sinking into the drifts as they plunged into the ravine's embrace. The walls rose sheer and iced, moonlight splintering off crystalline veins like shattered stars. Kyle moved with predatory economy despite his limp, his cloak billowing like raven wings. But pain etched his features, drawing his brow into furrows of quiet suffering. Blood from his throat soaked the collar of his tunic, a stark red against the gray wool, and Ilara found herself glancing at it, drawn by the symbolism. A king's lifeblood spilled not in battle's glory, but in mercy's quiet rebellion. What strength lay in such a choice? Not the claw's rip or the crown's decree, but the will to bear the abyss for another's sake. As they pressed on, the howls grew nearer, a chorus of malice weaving through the wind. Kyle paused at a cleft in the rock, his hand brushing hers as he steadied her over a slick ledge. Contact brief, electric, sending a shiver through her that had nothing to do with the cold. She pulled away, cheeks flushing beneath the frost-kissed pallor, rationalizing the spark as mere survival's illusion. He was alpha, she omega. Connection was biology's cruel jest, not fate's gift. Yet in his glance, she saw the melancholy that haunted his reign, the ghost of his lost mate, Alawan, whose death by a rival's treachery had forged his ethical core into unyielding steel. Guilt was his shadow, duty his chain, and now this war, sparked by his throat's offering, threatened to unravel it all. They emerged into a shallow hollow, ringed by boulders that gleamed like ancient sentinels under the moon's gaze. Kyle slumped against one, his breath ragged, pressing a torn strip of cloth to his wound. Ilara knelt at a distance, her fingers tracing the pendant's vial, its frozen blood a mirror to his fresh spill. The air between them thickened with unspoken questions. Why had he intervened for an unknown Omega? Why did her presence stir the embers of a fire he had long banked? Fear and curiosity danced in her chest, the instinctive bond denied by the scars of betrayal. But as the howls crested the ravine, closing in like a noose, she met his eyes again, seeing not a king, but a soul adrift in the same lunar storm. In that suspended breath, Ilara wondered if the Deusa wove redemption from such fragile threads, or if denial would only hasten their shared fall into the bloodied snow. The wind carried the answer on its icy breath, and for the first time, mercy felt less like weakness and more like the only path worth treading. And now, I invite you to leave a trace of your presence in the comments. Tell us where in the world you're watching from, and the exact hour you hear this story. We wish to know how far these northern confessions travel, and at what moments of the night they find you. The howls shattered the fragile peace of the hollow, a cacophony of spectral rage that clawed at the night like talons on frozen stone. Ilara's heart seized, the pendant's warmth a fleeting anchor against the surge of terror flooding her veins. The shadow hounds burst from the ravine's mouth, their forms a grotesque blur of sinew and smoke, eyes glowing like embers in the void, fangs dripping with ethereal ichor that sizzled on the snow. They were the coven's abominations, twisted by forbidden rites, neither fully beast nor spirit, but harbingers of the witch's insatiable hunger. Cale surged to his feet with a guttural snarl, his body coiling like a storm about to break, the gash at his throat weeping fresh crimson as he positioned himself between her and the onslaught. "Stay behind me," he commanded, voice laced with the raw authority of kingship, yet undercut by the rasp of pain. His golden eyes flicked to hers, a silent vow etched in their depths, protection, not possession. Ilara nodded, though her limbs trembled, the cold seeping deeper than the frost, mingling with the adrenaline that sharpened every sense. The air reeked of ozone and decay, the wind whipping flakes into a blinding veil that blurred the line between sanctuary and slaughter. She clutched the pendant, its vial pulsing like a second heart, as if the frozen blood within stirred in response to the spilling warmth of his wound. Mercy had drawn them here, but survival demanded more, a fragile alliance forged in the crucible of shared peril. The lead hound lunged, a mass of writhing shadow that expanded mid-leap, jaws unhinging to reveal a maw of endless night. Kyle met it head-on, shifting partially in a blur of motion, claws extending from his fingers as he raked across its flank. Black essence sprayed, hissing like acid on the snow, but the creature reformed, undeterred, its howl a psychic assault that clawed at Ilara's mind. Visions of chains and altars, of her own blood poured into the coven's chalice. She gasped, staggering back against the boulder, the intrusion a violation deeper than flesh. This was no mere hunt. It was the witch's probe, seeking the Pathfinder's essence she carried unknowingly, the gift that could illuminate paths through their encroaching darkness or seal it eternally. Kyle roared, driving the beast back with a swipe that tore through its core, but two more flanked him, their forms coalescing from the mist. Blood trickled from his side now, mingling with the snow and dark petals, and Ilara saw the toll, the limp worsening, his breaths labored, the weight of his self-inflicted scar a constant reminder of the war he had kindled. Guilt flickered in her chest, unbidden. He had offered his throat for strangers like her, upending realms in a bid for compassion, only to bleed alone in this forsaken glen. What was strength, if not the choice to shield the forsaken at the cost of one's own throne? She couldn't stand idle. The Omega in her yearned to aid, not cower. Gritting her teeth, Ilara scanned the hollow, her fingers brushing the pendant as instinct guided her gaze to a cluster of jagged rocks where moonlight pooled like liquid silver. A faint glow emanated from the snow there, crystals of ice, perhaps, or something older, a remnant of the Deuce's touch. The hounds circled, their howls sinking into a dissonant chant that vibrated through the earth, but she moved, driven by a spark she couldn't name. Scooping a handful of the luminous frost, she hurled it toward the nearest beast, her voice breaking free in an improvised plea to the lunar mother. By the moon's fractured light, bind what hunts in shadow. The crystals shattered on impact, exploding into a web of prismatic light that ensnared the hound's legs, freezing its smoky form into brittle shards. It shrieked, crumbling to ash, and Cale seized the moment, dispatching the second with a brutal twist of his jaws in half-shifted fury. The third faltered, sensing the shift, but he was upon it, claws sinking deep as he pinned it to the ground. Ilara watched, breath held, as he ended it with a mercy kill. Swift, clean, his eyes meeting hers over the fading wisps. Empathy bloomed in that exchange, a quiet bridge across the chasm of their worlds. He was no distant sovereign. He was a man marked by loss, his melancholy a mirror to her rejection, both of them exiles in their own right. Panting, Cale reverted fully, slumping against the boulder once more. his cloak a tattered shroud stained with ichor and blood. The hollow fell silent, save for the wind's mournful sigh and the distant crackle of embers. Perhaps a wildfire sparked by the war's fringes or the echo of battles yet to come. Alara approached cautiously, kneeling beside him, her hands hovering uncertainly. The scent of him enveloped her, pine and storm undercut by the copper tang of his wounds, a heady mix that stirred the instinctive bond she fought to deny. You fought like the Dusa herself guided your claws, he murmured, surprise softening the edges of his regal mask. His gaze traced her face, lingering on the pendant that now hung exposed, its vial thawed slightly. A droplet of blood gleaming within, like a captive star. She flushed, rationalizing the warmth in her chest as the afterglow of survival, not the deeper pull of connection. It was the light in the snow, she whispered, voice steadying as she tore a strip from her cloak to press against his throat. The contact was intimate, her fingers brushing his skin, sending a jolt through them both, fire in the freeze, undeniable yet resisted. He stiffened, not from pain, but from the vulnerability of acceptance, his ethical core warring with the alpha urge to claim what fate offered. Guilt shadowed his features. Eloin's ghost lingered in his hesitation, a reminder that love was no balm for the wounds he carried. Yet in her touch, he found a flicker of redemption, the Omega's quiet strength unraveling the armor of duty. As she bound the wound, the pendant swung forward, its chain catching the moonlight, and for a heartbeat, Alara felt it, a surge within, like threads of destiny unfurling. The frozen blood stirred, whispering of paths hidden, his war, her sacrifice, intertwined in the Dusa's loom. Empathy deepened to something perilously close to trust, the bond weaving tighter in the refuge's hush. But as the wind carried fresh howls, reinforcements perhaps, or the coven's wrath awakening, Alara pulled back, the dilemma etching her soul. To linger was to embrace this fragile union, to heal what was broken at the risk of her own fragile freedom. Or to flee, denying the fire that mercy had ignited. In the moon's watchful gaze, she wondered if bonds born of blood and shadow could truly shelter the heart, or if they would only summon greater storms. The snow whispered its ancient secrets, and in the silence, choice loomed like a blade's edge. The pendant's vial caught the moonlight like a captive ember, its thawed droplet quivering as if alive. And in that fragile instant, Alara felt the world tilt. A warmth bloomed from her core, not the tentative spark of survival, but a radiant unraveling, threads of light and shadow coiling through her veins like the Dusa's own breath. Her vision blurred, the hollow's boulders dissolving into a tapestry of silver lines, paths, infinite and intersecting, etched across the snow like veins of fate. The wind hushed, the distant howls fading to a murmur, as if the night itself held its breath. This was no fleeting instinct. It was the awakening she had never sought, the Pathfinder's gift surging forth unbidden, illuminating the chaos that bound them. Kyle's eyes widened, his hand stilling where it gripped her wrist, the touch a grounding anchor amid the storm within her. Blood from his throat seeped through the makeshift bandage, its copper scent mingling with the crisp bite of pine and the faint, acrid smoke drifting from the horizon, harbingers of the war's encroaching flames. He had seen such visions in ancient scrolls, whispered of in the northern realm's forbidden lore. The Omegas marked by the moon, who could trace destiny's loom and sever its knots. But to witness it in her, this exiled wisp of a woman, was to confront the Dusa's cruel poetry, his guilt-made war, her rejected blood, converging in a revelation that could either redeem or unravel them both. Alara, he breathed, the name a reverence on his lips, his golden gaze tracing the ethereal glow that now limned her form, faint as aurora veils against the snow. The gash at his neck pulsed with her proximity, a symbolic wound that mirrored the deeper scars of his soul. Eloin's lifeless eyes, the rival Alpha's triumphant snarl, the throne he had claimed through rivers of blood only to question its cost. He had offered his throat to the witches not from weakness, but from the ethical fire that burned beneath his melancholy, a king's duty twisted into compassion, igniting realms in rebellion. Yet now, as her gift manifested, he saw the key. She was no mere sacrifice, but the light to pierce the coven's veil, the pathfinder whose sight could guide his fractured packs to victory or peace. Guilt twisted in his chest, sharp as a blade. He had started this war for strangers, but to draw her into it was to burden her with his shadows. She gasped, the vision sharpening into clarity. Before her inner eye, paths forked like lightning. One led to Thorn's pack, her former alpha's campfires flickering in the distance, his betrayal a knot of cowardice tied to the witch's gold. Another veered north, to Kale's icebound citadel, where banners of gray steel whipped in gales and loyalists rallied against the encroaching dark. But entwined through them all was a crimson thread, blood, hers and his, linking the pendant's frozen essence to the fresh spill at his throat. It pulsed with possibility, a ritual under the full moon where her gift could bind the hound's shadows, turning the war's tide. Or a severance, her freedom bought by walking away, leaving him to the abyss his mercy had wrought. The weight of it crushed her, the revelation a double-edged gift, power born of rejection, demanding she choose not just survival, but the souls tethered to her sight. The glow faded, leaving her trembling, the cold rushing back like a rebuff. Alara pulled away, her fingers slick with his blood. The pendant now heavy against her chest, its vial fully thawed, the droplets suspended in defiant gleam. Rational thought clawed for purchase. This was no destiny she craved, only another chain, her omega heart resisting the alpha pull that thrummed between them. Yet the bond had deepened in that shared silence, empathy forging into something visceral, the air thick with the scent of pine resin and warming earth beneath the snow. Kyle rose slowly, his limp less pronounced, as if her touch had mended more than flesh. "You are the one," he said, voice a low cadence of awe and sorrow, the wind carrying it like a prophecy. "The pathfinder the legends foretold. The witches sought your blood to blind the paths, to cloak their darkness eternal. But you could light the way for us all." His words hung in the frost-laced air, stirring the embers of her defiance. She had been cast out as chattel, her life bartered for peace that proved illusory. Now this king, ethical to his core, haunted by the mate he couldn't save, saw in her not weakness, but salvation. The moon above fractured further, its light splintering on the bloodied snow like shattered vows, and Alara felt the Deuce's gaze, ancient and unyielding. Strength was not in yielding to the bond, nor in fleeing its fire, but in wielding the gift that rejection had unlocked. Yet doubt lingered, a shadow in her soul. Could she trust this melancholy sovereign, whose guilt might demand her as the war's final offering? The howls renewed in the distance, closer now, a reminder that revelation brought no sanctuary, only the precipice of choice. Kyle extended his hand again, not in command, but in quiet alliance, his scarred palm a map of battles fought and mercies granted. The cloak around his shoulders, torn and bloodied, fluttered like a banner of fragile hope. Alara met his eyes, the golden depths reflecting her own turmoil, and in that gaze she glimpsed the truth. Love was no swift balm, but a slow forging, resisted until the soul yielded to redemption's call. The pendant warmed once more, whispering of paths intertwined, and as the wind howled its lunar lament, she wondered if illuminating his destiny would heal her own fractured heart, or consign them both to the blood-soaked flames of war's embrace. The snow swirled in eddies, carrying the faint echo of weavos and the crackle of distant fires, and in the heart of the revelation, Alara stood at the loom's edge, threads of fate trembling in her grasp. Subscribe if you believe mercy can crown even the fallen. The fractured moon hung low, its light bleeding silver across the ravine's jagged lips, as Elara and Kyle crested the final ridge into the heart of Thorn's territory. The air thickened with the scent of wood smoke and damp earth, the pack's campfires flickering like wary eyes in the encroaching dusk. Her former home loomed ahead, a cluster of fur-draped tents ringed by sentinel pines, their branches heavy with the weight of winter's truce, now shattered by the war's distant rumble. Elara's steps faltered, the pendant at her throat a leaden pulse against her skin, its thawed vial sloshing softly with each breath, a crimson echo of the choices that had led her here. Revelation had unlocked her gift, but this confrontation demanded more, to face the past's claws and decide if forgiveness could temper the blade of retribution. Cale moved beside her, his limp a silent testament to the battles etched into his frame, the bandage at his throat darkened by fresh seepage. His golden eyes scanned the shadows, melancholy deepening the lines of his face. Guilt, a constant companion since Elowin's fall. He had led them here, not for conquest, but for truth. The traitor within Thorn's ranks whispered of by scouts, a rival alpha named Varric, whose ambitions fed the Coven's hunger. "We end this shadow at its root," he murmured, voice a gravelly anchor in the wind's howl, yet his hand brushed hers briefly. A resisted tether born of the bond they both denied. Love was no crown to claim lightly. It was a forge, heating the soul through trial, and Cale's ethical core recoiled at dragging her into the fray. Yet her Pathfinder sight had illuminated the path. Varric's betrayal, Thorn's complicity, the witch's gold that had marked her as sacrifice. The camp stirred as they approached, sentries huevos splitting the night like accusations. Figures emerged from the tents, wolves in half-shift, fur bristling under the moon's gaze, their breaths clouding the air like spectral warnings. Thorn stood at the center, his broad form silhouetted against a roaring fire, eyes narrowing as recognition dawned. Betrayal's scar twisted his features, once a mask of reluctant authority, now etched with the fear of exposure. "Elara," he growled, stepping forward, his pack flanking him in a semicircle of snarls and bared fangs. "The exile returns with the Northern King. Have you come to beg forgiveness, or to drag us into your war?" She halted, the snow crunching under her boots like brittle bones, the cold seeping through her cloak to mirror the chill in her heart. Memories flooded her. Nights mending his wounds by firelight, days of quiet service dismissed as weakness, the dawn of her banishment when his gaze had slid away, trading her life for the Coven's fleeting peace. Rejection had been his choice, cowardice cloaked in duty, and now the pendant burned, its blood stirring visions of forked paths. One of vengeance, her gift unraveling his alliances like frayed threads. Another of mercy, severing the Coven's hold without spilling kin's blood. Freedom tugged at her, a siren's call to turn and vanish into the pines, leaving this fractured pack to their fates. But Kyle's presence grounded her. His scent of storm and pine, a visceral reminder of the bond forged in refuge. The empathy that had bloomed into something deeper, resisted yet undeniable. Varric slunk from the shadows then, the rival alpha's form lean and predatory, his pelt scarred from old skirmishes, eyes gleaming with opportunistic fire. He was the traitor. Her sight confirmed it now, threads of dark gold linking him to the witch's obsidian altars. "The king who offered his throat," Varric sneered, circling with a low chuckle that echoed like cracking ice. "And the Omega sacrifice, risen like a ghost. Thorn sold you cheap, girl, but I see the power in your veins. Join us. Your gift could crown the Coven's eternal night and spare this war your precious king ignited." Cale tensed, a growl rumbling from his chest, his hand instinctively shielding Elara as the pack closed in. Blood pounded in her ears, the wind whipping flakes into a blinding swirl that tasted of ash and regret. Thorn's face crumpled, the weight of his complicity cracking his facade. "It was for the pack," he rasped, voice breaking like thin ice. "The witches promised stability. your blood. It was the price of peace. His eyes pleaded, a mirror to Kale's own guilt, two alphas bound by choices that wounded more than claws ever could. But Alara saw the lie in the threads, Thorn's ambition, Varric's whispers, the moral rot that had festered under the moon's blind eye. The confrontation erupted in a blur of motion. Varric lunged, shifting fully into a midnight wolf, jaws snapping toward Kale's flank. The king met him mid-air, claws raking fur in a clash that sprayed blood across the snow. Crimson blooms against white, symbolic as the pendant's vial. Thorn hesitated, his pack fracturing in confusion, some snarling loyalty, others backing away as Alara's gift flared unbidden. She raised her hands, the world tilting into silver lines, paths of loyalty severed, threads of betrayal glowing like veins of fire. "Enough," she whispered, her voice carrying on the wind like a lunar decree, and the air shimmered, forcing Varric back with an invisible snare. He yelped, form twisting in agony as the threads bound him, exposing his secrets, the coven's mark branded on his paw, gold-flecked and pulsing. The pack gasped, eyes turning to her in awe and fear. The fire's flames dancing shadows across their faces. Kale dispatched Varric with a swift strike, not to kill, but to subdue, his ethical restraint a blade tempered by loss. Thorn dropped to his knees, the rival's defeat unraveling his defenses. "Forgive me," he begged, voice raw as the wind's howl. "I chose the pack over you." Alara's heart tore, the dilemma a vice. Forgiveness meant weaving new paths, allying her gift with Kale's war for redemption, binding her freedom to love's uncertain fire. War meant retribution, her sight dooming Thorn and his kin to the coven's abyss, claiming a hollow victory that echoed her own rejection. She stepped forward, the pendant swinging free, its blood droplet catching the firelight like a tear of judgment. Kale watched. His breath held, golden eyes reflecting her turmoil, the melancholy king who had offered his throat for strangers, now offering his heart in silent plea. Love or freedom? The moon fractured above, casting prismatic shards on the bloodied snow, and Alara felt the Deuce's whisper. Strength lay not in claws or crowns, but in choosing mercy amid the storm. Yet as Thorn's gaze met hers, pleading for absolution, doubt clawed deeper. Could she forgive the past that had broken her, or would war's embrace heal through righteous flame? The wind carried the distant thunder of approaching forces, the war's tide rising, and in that suspended breath, Alara stood at the precipice, threads of fate trembling in her bloodied grasp, wondering if redemption demanded sacrifice or if freedom was the truest crown. The fractured moon wept silver tears upon the bloodied snow, as Alara's gift wove its final threads through the chaos of Thorn's camp, binding the air with an ethereal hush that silenced even the wind's relentless dirge. Varric lay subdued, his form twitching in the snare of luminous paths only she could see, his traitorous mark exposed like a festering wound under the fire's merciless glare. The pack encircled them, breaths ragged and eyes wide with a mixture of reverence and dread, their furred silhouettes flickering against the encroaching shadows of war. Thorn remained on his knees, the alpha who had once commanded her world, now reduced to a supplicant. His gaze a fractured mirror of regret, deep lines etched by the cowardice that had traded her life for illusory peace. The scent of smoke and iron hung heavy, mingling with the copper tang of spilled blood, a visceral reminder that every choice carved scars into the soul. Alara's heart thundered, a wild cadence against the pendant's insistent pulse at her throat. The vial's droplet quivered, fully thawed now, its crimson essence a living emblem of her lineage's hidden fire, the Pathfinder's blood that had slumbered through years of quiet endurance, only to awaken in the crucible of rejection. Freedom, whispered temptations, sever the threads binding Thorn to his pack, doom him to the coven's abyss, and claim a solitary path through the northern wilds, unburdened by the alpha bonds that had always chafed her spirit. Yet Kale's presence anchored her, his golden eyes a steady flame in the storm, reflecting the melancholy depth of a king who had bared his throat not for glory, but for the ethical imperative to spare the innocent. His guilt over Elowin lingered like frost on his breath, a shadow that made his every glance a quiet plea for alliance, for healing, for the redemption he dared not voice. Love between them was no swift conquest. It had simmered in resisted touches, rationalized as survival's illusion, until the revelation of her gift had forged it into something inevitable, a union born of shared wounds rather than desire's fleeting heat. The distant thunder swelled, the coven's forces cresting the ridge like a tide of writhing darkness, shadow hounds and cloaked witches, their chants a dissonant weave against the weavos of Kyle's rallying packs. War's maw yawned wide, demanding blood to sate its hunger, and Alara felt the Deuce's gaze upon her, ancient and unyielding, posing the ultimate query. What was strength? If not the mercy to heal, what power sought to destroy? Her fingers trembled as she extended a hand toward Thorn, the silver lines of fate shimmering in her vision, one path of vengeance, crimson and jagged, leading to pyres and howls of the fallen, another of compassion, softer, weaving gold through the fray to bind foes without slaughter. "Rise!" she commanded, her voice a poetic cadence laced with the moon's sorrow, steady despite the ache clawing her chest. "Your betrayal broke me, but it does not define us. The coven's shadow feeds on division. Let my sight light a different way." Thorn's eyes widened, tears carving paths through the grime on his face as the threads responded to her will. They uncoiled from Varric, not to kill, but to strip him bare, his form convulsing as the traitor's mark burned away, leaving him howling in exposure, a pariah cast to the snow without the pack's mercy. The rival Alpha scrambled back, vanishing into the pines as the Coven's vanguard crested the hill, but Thorn rose, his posture straightening under the weight of absolution. "Ilara, I chose fear over you," he rasped, voice breaking like ice under paw. "But if forgiveness is your gift, then I pledge my claws to this war, not for thrones, but for the light you carry." The pack murmured, loyalty shifting like wind through branches, their snarls turning to resolute growls as her Pathfinder essence illuminated the true enemy. The witch's encroaching veil, a darkness that could engulf them all if not pierced by unity. Kale stepped forward then, his hand finding hers in a grip that was neither command nor claim, but partnership, scarred palm against her chilled fingers, the warmth of his bloodied throat seeping through the bandage like a vow sealed in sacrifice. The bond surged between them, instinctive yet earned, the alpha pull yielding to the deeper fire of mutual redemption. His melancholy softened in that touch, the ghost of Elowin fading not in erasure, but in the promise of renewal, a king's guilt transmuted into purpose through the Omega who had healed what rejection had shattered. "You choose not just peace," he murmured, his breath clouding the air like a shared secret, "but rebirth, for us all." Alara met his gaze, the resisted love finally accepted, not as reward, but as proof. Destiny was no chain, but a path chosen freely, where compassion crowned the fallen and wove freedom from despair's loom. As the first shadows lunged, Alara channeled her gift, the pendant flaring like a lunar beacon. Silver threads erupted from her core, lancing through the night to ensnare the hounds, freezing their forms into crystalline prisons that shattered under the pack's unified assault. Thorn's wolves joined Kale's, a symphony of claws and fangs under the moon's fractured benediction, turning the tide not through slaughter's blaze, but through the precise severance of dark rites, the witches' chants faltering as their veils tore, revealing paths to retreat rather than conquest. Blood stained the snow, but sparingly, a ritual offering to the Deuce's balance, sacrifice in unity, healing in forgiveness, union in the quiet strength that bound Ilara and Kyle. The battle waned as dawn's first pallor bled across the horizon, the coven's remnants fleeing into the mist-shrouded pines, their power fractured by the light she had unleashed. Elara leaned into Kale's side, exhaustion weaving through her like a gentle tide, the pendant now cool against her skin, its vial empty, a vessel fulfilled, its blood spent in renascimento. The wind sighed its approval, carrying away the echoes of howls and the acrid bite of dying fires, leaving only the crisp scent of fresh snow and pine, symbols of a world reborn. In his arms, she felt the weight lift. Rejection's scar faded to a faint line, her Omega heart no longer servant, but sovereign in its own right. Kale's lips brushed her temple, a tender ache born of the pain they had traversed, his voice a low rumble against her ear. You have mended what I thought eternally broken. In you, I find not just a queen, but the mercy that redeems a king's folly. Under the mending moon, as the packs gathered in wary alliance, Elara knew the truth. Love was the ultimate redemption, a flame kindled in the forge of choice, illuminating paths where despair once reigned. The northern realms stirred with fragile hope, war's embers banked into the hearth of possibility, and in that union, she was whole, pathfinder of destinies intertwined, healer of wounds both seen and unseen. The Deusa smiled through the clouds, her symbols etched eternal, blood as bond, fire as faith, and the moon as witness to souls rising from the snow's cold embrace. If your heart beat alongside ours, like, comment, and subscribe. Because every soul that joins our moon keeps the flame of redemption alive.